Hey up internet, and welcome back to Black Sofa. And today I want to welcome a special guest, Godless Engineer. And as most of you um, may well know, he is a very prolific atheist YouTuber, um, and he is. I've asked him to come in and help me dissect this article by SJ Thomason because about the historicity of Jesus, because he is a mythicist and he really knows his shit. So um, this should be a very interesting video. So if you're interested in that stuff, then stay tuned. So um, GE, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here to talk about this subject and just to, hang out with you for a little while.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Um, and I gather that you're quite familiar with the article that we're going to be talking about.
Oh yes, I read through it a few times, and I actually already had some points written up for some future videos that I'm planning on doing on my channel. Just really short, to the point kind of videos where I dissect like one particular source and I explain why this isn't good evidence, for Jesus. And so I was already planning that. And so SJ's article here pretty much hits all of the ones and gives me a few more to actually add to my list.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Excellent. So I think what we'll do is we'll go through the article point by point. I'll probably make a few of my own observations, and then I'll hand things over to your expertise. So the article is by SJ Thomason, aka the Christian Apologist, and it's entitled Early Secular Sources Support New Testament Accounts of Jesus' Divinity. And she starts off by saying the foundation upon which Christianity rests in Jesus' resurrection. If the resurrection did not occur, early Christian disciples would have remained in hiding, fearful of persecution. If the resurrection did not occur, they would likely have returned to their positions prior to Jesus' ministry, and their cause would have died down as a realization that their leader had died an excruciating and demeaning death sunk in. And I suppose, in a way, this is true. The claims of Christianity hinge on whether or not the resurrection of Jesus Christ actually happened.
Well, I feel like SJ right here is actually getting a lot of this from Paul, because Paul actually says this, if I'm not mistaken, in one of his writings, because he talks about how, well, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then all of our effort is in vain, or us being a Christian means nothing, or whatever. So I feel like she's getting it from Paul, but also I would say that this is a bit of a false dichotomy, because of course she's ruling out the possibility that he was made up, that he was mythical. And hopefully today I can give people a reason to at least consider that an option, so that it's not just this dichotomy of, well, either he resurrected and, the resurrection is the reason why Christianity rose to such heights, or if he didn't resurrect, then it would have died off, so therefore he had to have resurrected. And I would say that I think that Christianity could have definitely continued on even if he didn't resurrect. This totally throws out the option of people continuing his own or like Christians that supposedly experienced Jesus's death, like they could have went on and like just lied about it if they wanted to, because we know that like the Gospels weren't written by the people that they're named after, and none of the accounts were written by actual firsthand witnesses. And so that's the reason why, like, oh, well, they died for a lie. It's like, well, no, not really, because those people that actually would have, quote unquote, lied about it wouldn't have necessarily been the ones that were executed. It would have been people that believed the original people or whatnot that made it up. So just kind of heading off that particular route. But anyways, I'll let you continue.
Okay. She goes on to say, but they did not remain in hiding, and Christianity did not die down. Consider that Christianity had estimated 5 to 6 million adherents prior to 313 AD, when legalized by Constantine. Why, you ask, did so many people believe despite the potential for persecution?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure about her number here, like the whole 5 to 6 million adherents by 313. I mean, the Jews and Christians have always overinflated their numbers. I mean, by the time that Josephus, which we're going to get to here in a minute, by the time that was put in there, I mean, they were referring to the tribes of Christians, and tribes of Christians didn't exist until like well into the 2nd century. So I'm not exactly sure about having 5 to 6 million adherents by 313. I mean, obviously it was a substantial amount, but it was really Constantine that kind of elevated Christianity and kept it going. Otherwise, it would have just been another like cultish group.
Oh, yeah, certainly. And the fact that there's a myth that he, before a battle, he saw a cloud shaped like a cross, and so he made a vow that if he won the battle, he would follow the god of the cross. And so he painted a red cross on the shields of the soldiers, and of course they won the battle, and so he dedicated his life to the God of Christianity. And but this is just legend, it's myth. It's not. There's no historical evidence for this at all.
Yeah, and interesting thing about that is the actual account went from like a personal like revelation by Constantine, and then it got blown up into like everybody like in his army saw it. And I believe the one where it got blown up into everybody seeing it was actually Eusebius of Caesarea who propagated that. So even that particular vision or whatnot has had its own kind of troubled past as far as historicity goes. Obviously, it's perfectly reasonable that Constantine could have hallucinated it, even if there were other people around him that saw it too. Group hallucinations, as we know, can indeed happen. There was the dancing sun thing over in, I believe it was Portugal, where a lot of people saw the sun dancing in the sky, and obviously the sun doesn't dance. That's physically impossible. So, yeah.
And who knows? If he'd have seen a cloud shaped like a giant phallus, I dare say history would have been very different.
It's like, well, we're gonna draw big dicks on our shield. We're gonna go to war. Trust me, they won't see it coming.
Yeah. So, and of course, most historians debate whether whether Constantine's conversion to Christianity was genuine, or whether it was politically expedient for him to convert to Christianity and make Christianity the universal religion to in order to unite the Roman Empire.
Well, yeah, actually, I believe Constantine played both sides as far as religion goes, because he played the side of the pagans, but he also played the side of the Christians. And I think I'm not sure if that's how a lot of the pagany things got really worked into Christianity. I know at some point, like the virgin birth and all of that got worked in, and that I'm wanting to say that was about in the 2nd century, because you have historians that were talking about, people that believed in this virgin birth, but it seemed too pagan for some. And so we know that like originally Jewish Christians were the ones that believed in Christ, and so they had to believe in like a Davidic lineage. That's why you have the different lineages in Matthew and Luke. They needed to believe in that, so that's why they traced it through Jesus's supposed father, because originally Jesus was conceived like as just a regular human, and then he was inhabited by the Messiah spirit that pre-existed like everything and was with God at the beginning. That's what First John, or not First John, but the Gospel of John says. Talks about the Messiah existing prior to the creation of the universe. And so yeah, the early Christians would have believed like in an earthly bound Jesus that had no virgin birth or anything like that. That's what they originally believed. And then later on, in order to get more pagans to accept Christianity, they added in a little bit of pagan ideas like a virgin birth. Like pagans have had demigods being born from, gods having sex with mortal women, forever. And so that was a natural thing for them, and it was easier for them to convert to the religion with that.
But wasn't there talk about the virgin birth in Matthew's gospel before John's gospel was written?
Oh wait, I'm sorry. What was the beginning of that question?
Wasn't there? What didn't Matthew in his gospel say that Jesus was born of a virgin?
Yes, Matthew and Luke are the two gospels that have the birth narratives. I can't remember what John says about it. I don't think that John doesn't have a birth narrative, but it's just it just has Matthew. Matthew and Luke are the only two with birth narratives. Matthew copied off of Mark, and then Luke used both Mark and Matthew to create his.
And John, well, we don't know it was John, but the evangelist, the writer of the fourth gospel, his narrative is completely different.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's like that particular author was the kid in the class that likes to lick the walls. That's kind of who the gospel writer of John was.
Yeah. Anyway, SJ goes on. She says, Jesus resurrected from the dead, and early believers who were eyewitnesses to this event refused to recant their testimonies. So, were there eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection?
Well, no. I mean, this particular sentence is unverifiable because there's no historical evidence to suggest there were eyewitnesses that were writing about it or anything like that. But I mean, SJ comes from the type of Christian that thinks that like the gospel authors are the gospel names. Like she thinks that they are literal like firsthand witnesses of what happened to Jesus. So that's why she thinks this. And the fact that these people never recanted so as to destroy the religion, I would say that doesn't match with reality, because we know that the first or the authors of these gospels already wholly believed in the idea of Jesus in order to write their gospels. And since they were pulling from even earlier sources, that kind of seems to me like they wouldn't have had to recant or anything like that. Plus, it's not like there hasn't been any Christian like in the past that has recanted being a Christian. I would fully expect that to be possible. I'm not saying that I know for certain that these people did that, but I'm just saying that just like people lying. I mean, that's easy for people to do. It's also easy for people to recant being a Christian if they wanted to. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Like, I don't think that it's a highly improbable thing.
Okay, but didn't Paul, in one of his letters, say that 500 people witnessed Jesus, Jesus' resurrection? And he goes on to say in the same letter that some of them are still alive to this day. Now,
Well, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I mean, that's what Paul does say, but for one thing, he's very vague about these people that saw him. Plus, another thing is that they didn't see, like, it's not that they saw him resurrect, it's they saw a vision of the resurrected Jesus. And that's very important, because seeing a vision of the resurrected Jesus and seeing somebody actually get up that was once dead and is now alive, those are two totally different things. So you really have to take into context what he's talking about here. He's saying that these 500 people had a vision of Jesus. And for one thing, group hallucinations are definitely possible. As I denoted earlier with the dancing sun miracle in Portugal. But there's been other instances of like group hallucinations. If you just look at any kind of faith healing sermon, you get these charismatic people that are so convincing, and they get people charged up into that right moment where you can swing your coat in the air and you can knock them down because they feel the force of Jesus or the Holy Spirit or whatever. And so, group manipulation and hallucination are very probable.
Yeah. Okay. So she goes on to say details of Jesus's life are documented both biblically and extra biblically. We have gospel accounts of the empty tomb and Jesus's resurrection, along with accounts from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, Romans 1:4, Philippians 3:10 to 11, and 2 Timothy 2 verse 18. What do you want to say to that?
Well, yeah, but for one thing, Paul says that he had a vision of the resurrected Jesus, not Jesus's resurrection. So, this particular sentence is a bit disingenuous, because again, she's conflating seeing Jesus actually rise from the dead with having a vision of Jesus. And that's what Paul does. He literally says that he gets his information from no man on earth, and he only got it from the scriptures and from the risen Jesus, or a vision of Jesus. And so if you take that for what he's saying that, he had these hallucinations about Jesus, and he was reading the scripture in order to pull information about Jesus. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, it starts off with a reference to what was it? I'm wanting to say maybe Isaiah 53 starts off with a reference to Isaiah 53, which is the suffering servant thing. And so it's pretty plainly obvious that they were looking to the scriptures. But more importantly, Paul here not only used the scriptures, but he claimed to have seen a vision of Jesus.
Okay. And she also claims that we have further 5 non-Christian sources who confirm Jesus' death by crucifixion. These are Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Mara bar Serapion, and the Talmud. And she quotes the source Habermas and Lycona 2004. And
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just about to say, what are your thoughts on these
Well,
sources that she's quoting here?
right. Obviously, I don't think that these particular things prove that Jesus was actually crucified, or even existed. But I know that she's going to list them down below, so I know that I'll have more to explain on each one of these, plus some that she didn't mention. But all of these either were forged or just mention Christians existing at a certain time, and or they're so far out of date that they can't give us any kind of accurate picture of the first century. So, yeah, like I said, we'll go a bit more into detail about it when we get down below.
Okay, sure. Um, she she goes on to say we have 7 sources pointing to multiple very early and eyewitness testimonies to the disciples' claims of witnessing the risen Jesus, who all note that early disciples were willing to suffer for their beliefs in Jesus. Luke in Acts, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, and Origen. And it's she quotes she quotes the same source, Habermas and Lycona 2004.
Right. Well, I would say that like these people in there, they already believed that Jesus actually existed. They already believed in the magical Jesus, if you will. So, I mean, the fact that they died for their faith or whatnot is in no way proof that Jesus actually existed or that anything in the Bible is true. They, historicists and apologists, they like to paint this as some kind of like virtue of these people, like, oh, if it was a lie they wouldn't have died for it. Okay, well, that requires them to know it was a lie, and I'm not saying that any of these people thought it was a lie at the time.
Yeah, I remember hearing a sermon where the guy preaching he was quoting from Fox's Book of Martyrs, as if it was fact. But I later learned that Fox basically made all this shit up. Have you read Fox's Book of Martyrs?
No, I haven't.
Well, but basically, a lot of apologists like to quote, from Fox's Book of Martyrs as if he's a true historian, as if as if what he's saying is factual, but actually, he basically made it up, and it's been, most scholars, are in agreement that Fox, pulled this stuff out of his ass, basically, about the martyrs, about people, about the apostles dying for their faith, and especially Peter being crucified upside down. That is complete fiction, basically. What are your thoughts on that story?
Well, yeah, there is a book called Persecution by I can't remember her name, but there's a book on persecution that actually chronicles the history of persecution of Christians, and what we actually find is that a lot of these persecution stories are really just myths. People talk about how these people were persecuted for being a Christian, and it's like that didn't actually happen, or it didn't happen in that way. So it doesn't surprise me that those particular things wouldn't be historical.
Yeah, exactly. So where did I get up to? Yeah,
Finally, we have eyewitness testimonies.
Oh yeah. That's yeah. So finally, we have eyewitness testimonies from disciples Peter, Mark, Matthew, Paul, James, and Jude, along with the testimony of Luke, who authored the book of Luke and Acts. In Acts, Luke refers to himself in the first person when traveling with Paul, who knew Peter and James, which suggests he was well aware and had first-hand knowledge of the testimonies of at least Peter, James, and Paul. How do you rate Luke's historical narrative? Is he a reliable historian, or what do you think of Luke?
Well, I mean, Luke. It wasn't literally Luke that wrote that. We call the person Luke, but the same person wrote both Luke and Acts. That's why it's labeled as Luke Acts most of the time. And while he does, refer to himself in the first person when traveling with Paul, I can't right off the top of my head remember whether or not Paul actually acknowledges having a Luke with him. I know that he did have to have his stuff dictated to somebody. So regardless of who it was, Luke would have known this Luke Acts person. If they were traveling with Paul, I guess they would have known it. But also we know that Luke copied his particular gospel off of Matthew and Mark, and then he made further changes and made it even more magical. So I would say that his credibility as far as being historical is pretty shot, regardless of whether or not he was actually traveling with Paul. But I mean, also Paul was writing in the 50s, and so that would put Luke, being with Paul in the 50s, and then 20 years later, or not 20, but maybe like 30 or 40 years later, then Luke wrote his gospel and everything like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of fucky things going on with that.
So yeah, I think I remember a while ago seeing a lecture by Richard Carrier about Luke, about Luke, saying that I can't remember exactly what he said, but he definitely did not rate Luke as a historian at all. I don't know if you've seen, seen Richard Carrier speak about Luke, but he certainly doesn't rate Luke as a reliable, as a credible historian at all.
Well, no, yeah, I can't remember exactly what Carrier's position is on Luke and whatnot, but it doesn't surprise me that he wouldn't find him all that credible. I mean, like I said, Luke, the author of Luke, the Gospel, it would have been written in the 80s and 90s, right around the same time as John, I guess, was being written, because John was written in the 90s to the like 110s. So Luke would have been written after Matthew, but before that. And so, I mean, you're talking like a really wide time span between Paul and Luke writing his stuff.
Yeah. And talking of Richard Carrier, SJ talks, goes on to talk about him. He says, she says, non-believers, such as Richard Carrier, have often challenged historians' majority consensus that the Gospels are historical biographies to make the claim that they are instead of a mythical genre. And of course, she's using a appeal to authority fallacy here.
Yeah, yep, she is. I mean, just because a majority of like historians or whatnot think something, that doesn't mean that it's actually true. If you just look at how we went as far as like how the Old Testament was written, we originally thought that Moses authored the first 5 books. of the Old Testament, and then we eventually made our way to the documentary theory, which is the consensus right now. That chronicles how the Old Testament was put together, how the wording and how the references to God don't make sense if it was all the same author. And so we eventually got there, but it wasn't only because of textual criticism, it was also archaeological finds, because they actually figured out through archaeology and finding different historical sites that the Israelites were actually Canaanites that just outperformed the other Canaanites, and they grew, and it was never in the millions or whatnot that like the Book of Numbers actually denotes, because in the Book of Numbers they just count like the men, and I think just the men are near 1 million or so. Yeah, it's just the men 20 to 50. And so you kind of figure with women, children, and all that. Yeah. So, I mean, you're looking at well over 1 million people.
Yeah. Which is ridiculous. But what do you say to people to Christian apologists who like to say that, well, Richard Carrier is just on the fringe of of the Jesus, historical Jesus, what's the word? What's the term I'm looking for? But what do you say to people who say that Richard Carrier is just on the fringe? He's not in agreement with any other serious academic at all. He's just on the fringe.
Right. Well, I mean, what I would say is that he's not so on the fringe, because people have been questioning the historicity of Jesus for a while. It's actually gaining a lot of ground. You have a lot more people that are investigating it and actually coming to the opinion that they're either agnostic on whether or not Jesus existed, or they're full-blown mythicists. And there is an element of like crazy to the mythicist, I guess, community or group or whatnot, because you have people that just make wild assertions with no evidence whatsoever. And I never really found myself convinced by those arguments. But the reason why I was really drawn to Carrier's work, as well as other people that he not only suggests, but people that I've just found in general, is that they have like evidence to cast doubt on whether or not Jesus existed. And then to draw a parallel, I mean, if you just look at how we figured out how the Old Testament was written, I mean, that was considered the fringe idea when it was first proposed. And it took a while for it to actually gain traction in the community of scholars. And but I mean, once it did, that became the consensus. And then if you look at Louis Pasteur and germ theory, I mean, before that, we thought that like spirits, like, I don't know, gave us some kind of sin virus, and that's what made us sick or whatnot. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur made his discoveries and proposed germ theory that we were able to start gaining traction in actual science on it. And it took a while. Like, it wasn't like an overnight thing. It's like, oh, hey, look, there's organisms in this microscope. It wasn't like that. It took a long time, and there were people that pushed back against it, and they called it fringe and everything like that. So I would say that any major change in any field that you go through, the people that are proposing something different are always going to be labeled fringe. But if the theory holds up, then it will survive that test. I mean, we always talk about how, well, if you have a theory and it's supported by facts, then it will survive any kind of criticism. And right now, that's what it's going through. That's what the theory in general is going through. And so I think that it's only a matter of time before we get to a point where we're like, well, maybe he didn't exist. Like I'm not going to say that 100% he didn't exist, but I think that we'll get to a point where it's like, well, he probably didn't.
What other scholars do you know of apart from Richard Carrier who are now beginning to um, come in line with Richard Carrier's way of thinking?
Well, I mean, there's hold on. Oh yeah, Raphael Lataster. He's a New Testament scholar, I think, and he's currently agnostic on the whole question. But I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are starting to doubt Jesus actually existing because of the fact that there's just no good evidence for it. And I've actually got a list here. Earl Doherty, Kurt Knoll, David Fitzgerald's a good one. Well, no, he's not a scholar. Okay, here, credible experts. I'll just go through. I'll go through the list that they currently have on the Crestus app. Hector Avalos, Thomas Brody, Arthur Droge, Raphael Lataster, Kurt Knoll, Robert Price, and Thomas L. Thompson. And those are just the ones that are listed in the app.
Oh, okay. So quite a few are coming round to to this way of thinking, to the mythicist way of thinking. Then,
yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, they're either agnostic or they're mythicist. Like Lataster, he's agnostic. He just doesn't know whether or not Jesus actually existed, and he can't say for certain that the probability is higher one way or another.
Okay. So she goes on. I've lost the thing. Excuse me.
I think it's he and his peers further assert.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he. Let me just bring up the article again. Yeah, she goes on to say that Richard Carrier and his peers yes. They assert that early Christian disciples such as Paul, Peter, and James, who claimed to have seen the risen Jesus, had hallucinations, rather than honestly examining why these early disciples braved decades of persecutions and endured beatings, stonings, imprisonments, beheadings, and crucifixions to prove their claim. They dismissed them as schizotypal or as delusional.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, as far as cults and religions in general go, schizotypal people are drawn to those. There's several, studies that have shown that schizotypals are drawn to those kind of communities, mainly because they're not ostracized by the community. They're actually, held up pretty high in high regard because they have these experiences. They feel like they're more in tune with whatever faith they have. And it's not so much dismissing them as that, it more so is trying to explain these visions that they had, because none of these people actually say, I literally saw Jesus walking on this earth, then he died, and then he resurrected. Like, for instance, with Paul, who's the only one that actually wrote any kind of historical document in that list that she has, he only says visions in the scriptures. He never associates Jesus with a person here on earth. While Jesus does mention some things that are in the Gospels, Paul's writings existed way before the Gospels, so it's more likely that they pulled that information from Paul rather than like Jesus telling them, because it was Jesus that conveyed to Paul about the Last Supper and all of that. And the purpose of the Last Supper is to replace the Passover meal and the previous covenant that they had with God. That's the whole point for that particular portion of the theology. And so anything that Paul has said about Jesus, about what Jesus had done, or the theology of Christianity, was only given to Paul through visions or through scriptures.
Okay. She goes on to say, implying a mass hallucination and applying a schizophrenia diagnosis to explain the actions of ancient people in history is not an approach used by professional historians or psychologists, suggesting that all early worshippers of Jesus experienced hallucinations and had schizophrenia, which is a chronic and severe neurological brain disorder affecting 1.1% of the population, only exposes their biases against Jesus.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, she's very disingenuous in these couple of sentences, because nobody's suggesting that all the early worshipers, had schizophrenia. And even then, we're not even suggesting that they had schizophrenia. It was schizotypal people, and schizophrenia can come in varying degrees. There are people that could be diagnosed with schizophrenia that can function in society, that aren't a danger to other people, and then there are people with severe schizophrenia. And so I would say that, as far as psychologists go, I would think that if anybody came to us like, oh, I had a vision of this guy I saw die last year or last week or something, I think that they would probably, suggest schizophrenia or something like that. So I don't exactly know where she's getting the whole idea that psychologists wouldn't do that, because it sounds exactly like what psychologists would do. But also the whole professional historians wouldn't do that. I'm not sure about that particular portion of it, because what we're talking about now is explaining our hypothesis. Like, we have the hypothesis that they were schizotypal. Well, what kind of evidence is there to suggest that they might be? Well, they had visions, and we know through scientific research that schizotypal people are drawn to these kind of religious crowds. So it seems like the hypothesis holds up, and there's nothing to actually dictate that he couldn't have been that. So I don't want people to think that just because, oh, this guy says he had a vision, therefore he absolutely has schizophrenia. I'm saying that the probability of somebody having a vision of somebody that died last week, the probability of them having schizophrenia, even a very mild case of it, is way more probable than the fucker actually coming back from the dead.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to skip a paragraph and get to where she, gets to the main point of her article, where she starts, citing these extra biblical sources for the historicity of Jesus. She says, historians often request two sources of evidence when piecing together histories, yet we have an astounding 42 sources within 150 years of Jesus' resurrection that support accounts of Jesus. These are as follows. 1. 9 traditional authors of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, author of Hebrews, James, Peter, and Jude. Okay, we'll just pause there. Do you want to talk about those traditional sources?
Well, right. I mean, obviously, those aren't eyewitnesses. Those were written well after Paul was writing, so there's no independence there for those. Also, I would say that Mark is the earliest gospel, so that would be the most independent. But even Mark is probably using Paul as well as other sources in order to construct his gospel. But even then, Mark is a very bare bones gospel that doesn't say anything about his birth, just talks about him being a minister or whatnot, spreading his message and then dying. And it doesn't even have him like coming back from the dead originally. Like it just has the women finding the tomb. And then later on in about the 2nd century, Christians came in and added information to the very end of Mark. I think it's the last like 12 verses of Mark were actually added in the 2nd century in order to corroborate the whole, Jesus rose from the dead and he started appearing to people. So, I mean, that right there it would explain all of that. Those don't actually prove that Jesus existed at all.
The thing I like about Mark's gospel is that the way the Greek is constructed, it literally ends as and the women were afraid of, and that's it. That's literally how it ends. And
Yeah.
as you say, the rest was added later. But that's a bit of an aside. So she goes on to number 2, 20 early Christian writings outside of the New Testament: Clement of Rome, Second Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Martyrdom of Polycarp, Barnabas, Didache, Shepherd of Hermas, fragments of Papias, Justin Martyr, Aristides, I'm going to butcher this, Athenagoras, Theophilus of Antioch, Quadratus, Aristo of Pella, Melito of Sardis, Diognetus, Gospel of Peter, Apocalypse of Peter, and Epistula of Apostolorum.
Yeah, those wouldn't prove that he existed either. I would say that most of those either were written way like far after the supposed events, too far for them to actually be drawing off of firsthand accounts. So you couldn't exactly consider them to be independent because they were already affected by the Christian culture that had been growing and spreading. And that's one thing I've kind of harped on getting to these points, is because what you need to really look at is the time in which these were written, whether or not they're independent, and then explanatory power. And like those are 3 pretty good bullet points to go by when assessing whether or not these could actually prove Jesus or say anything substantial about him, because most of these are written way too far after the events supposedly happened, which causes them to not be independent, and they wouldn't have any kind of explanatory power about like Jesus, his early life, and anything like that. So most likely what these sources do is just corroborate that Christians existed, like in the late 1st century and 2nd, 3rd century, which nobody's disputing that they existed.
And certainly, I know from my studies at Bible college that the Didache, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, these are fraudulent anyway. So why she's relying on them, I don't know.
Yeah, which I'm kind of interested. It's interesting that she doesn't at all seem to know about the Ascension of Isaiah, which is actually a first century Jewish text that, well, I guess I know why she wouldn't mention it here. Because in the Ascension of Isaiah, what happens is Isaiah is called up to the multiple levels of heaven, and he actually witnesses the Messiah descending from the upper levels of heaven to be crucified or not or killed by the devil in the lower heavens, and then he's resurrected in the lower heavens and ascends back up into the upper heavens. And that's what the Ascension of Isaiah is, and which is eerily similar to what supposedly happened to Jesus. And so I think that it's kind of odd how she knowingly seems to not investigate actual stuff that would contradict herself.
Yeah, because of course it doesn't fit in with her narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, so number 4, 9 secular non-Christian sources: Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Phlegon, Lucian, Celsus, Mara bar Serapion, Suetonius, and Thallus.
Yep.
And okay, so let's tackle these one at a time, because she quotes these these sources. First of all, Josephus, and the quote is: "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders."
Right. So this particular passage is most likely a later insertion, either by Eusebius of Caesarea or his predecessor. And I have really good reasons for suggesting this. For one thing, nobody mentions this particular paragraph from Josephus until Eusebius, which Eusebius is known to alter church histories and to invent things like Constantine's vision in the sky. He altered that to make it more prolific or whatever. And so there's that. But also the text doesn't make sense how it's written. So like how it's actually written on the face of it, for one thing, it interrupts a flow of thought. And so it seems more like a speed bump, or like just where something was inserted where it doesn't need to be, and it actually breaks up a flow of thought. So there's that, because the previous paragraph talks about Pilate killing a bunch of Jewish protesters over a water dispute. And then it goes on in the paragraph after it, and it seems to reference the Pilate killing a bunch of Jews over water, because it starts off like and another sad calamity or something like that. So it ends up referencing the paragraph before the Jesus paragraph. But also there's been a professional, like scholarly analysis on the actual passage, and the way that the passage is constructed with verbs and other different sentence things, it doesn't make sense. And it actually does not match the rest of Tacitus, or not Tacitus, Josephus. It doesn't match the rest of Josephus. So there's that. Another thing is that a lot of people want to say, well, he probably wrote it, but what's in there now is like an elaboration by a later author. And that might trip you up until you consider the fact that somebody else has done the actual scholarly work and proven that any connection to that kind of version of this originates with Eusebius. So no matter what route you go, the first person to actually mention this even existing is Eusebius of Caesarea, who's suspect in and of itself, himself. So Josephus is not a very good, this particular paragraph in Josephus is not a very good source to go to in order to prove that Jesus existed or whatnot. I mean, if you just look at the paragraph as she's written it, it mentions the Messiah or whatnot. This is not at all how Josephus references the other would-be messiahs. He calls them imposters and all, and he's very denigrating to them. There's this one called the Egyptian, where he called him a failed prophet or something like that. Who was actually trying to fulfill the military version of Jesus prior to this mythical one being invented. So yeah, I mean, I think that thoroughly debunks the Josephus one.
Yeah. Okay, so number 2, Tacitus. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular.
Right. So for Tacitus here, she does something. I mean, she's changed the actual thing because they call them Christians. That first one, they don't call them Christians; they call them Christians. And then the next part is it's an interpolation saying Christus. It actually isn't legible, that particular letter that's between the R and the S. And so people just assumed that it was Christus and whatnot. But also, I would say that Christus is not Jesus's name. Now, I get a lot of shit for this, okay? But when I was growing up, I thought that like when Jesus mailed a letter, he wrote Jesus Christ on it, okay? I thought that Christ was his last name, but it wasn't. And also, Christus is not a name but a title. So even if Tacitus referred to whoever as Christus, it's still a title and not a person. You would think that they would actually mention like the actual person's name, like Jesus of Nazareth or something like that. That's generally how you would have referenced them, but this particular passage doesn't. Another problem with this passage is that nobody else accounts for like Christians being blamed by Nero. There were plenty of other historians that were actually in Rome at the time, and none of them recorded Nero blaming the Christians for it. Prior to right around Suetonius's time, I think there was actually a Chrestus that was causing a bunch of problems, which was just about 10 years prior to the burning of Rome. And so it's more likely that this particular passage, if it wasn't, if this is an actual true report, was most likely referencing Christians, not Christians. So even if you took this at face value, all it says is that Christians were in Rome, like in the 64 AD. Like that's the best that you could do. But, Tacitus was also talking to Pliny the Younger, which is our next section, but that's how he would have known about Christians. Also, this particular portion of annals, I don't know how to say this. It always sounds dirty when I say it. Annals, whatever. It was actually written in the 2nd century. So, I mean, he was writing these things in the 2nd century about things that happened like 40 years before. Okay. Yes, honey, the ass fucking 1544.
And she goes on to quote from Pliny the Younger. Um, It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never practiced in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offences it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. I have been not a little hesitant as to whether there should be any distinction on account of age, or no difference between the very young and the more mature, whether pardon is to be granted for repentance, or if a man has once been a Christian, it does him no good to have ceased to be one, whether the name itself, even without offences, or only the offences associated with the name, are to be punished. And I won't read the whole thing, but it goes on
Right.
and on.
Well, to summarize the Pliny the Younger thing here, basically Pliny the Younger is a judge and he is judging Christians. And what he does is he asks them 3 times or so, like, are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? And if they confirm it every time he asks them, then he puts them to death. And through the course of this, he learns about what they believed and everything. And that's how he knows about their particular faith. And all the Pliny the Younger does is prove that there were Christians in the 2nd century. I mean, that's legitimately all that it does. So Pliny the Younger is not a very good source to use at all, due to that fact. He was writing in the 2nd century, and he only talks about persecuting Christians, basically. So it only makes sense that he's only proving that Christians existed, which nobody's saying that they didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And number 4, Lucian referred to Christians as poor wretches who have persuaded themselves that they will be immortal. He said that Christians referred him as a god, next after that whom they still worship, a man crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world.
Right. So, I mean, this off the bat, I mean, it violates the time and independence criteria. It also doesn't have any kind of explanatory power as far as the origins of Christianity or whether or not Jesus existed. The only thing that this explains is that he was around Christians, and he knew about the Christian faith. So all Lucian does is regurgitate what Christians already believed.
Yeah, and time is getting on. So, but basically, she quotes from other sources that basically they don't say anything about Jesus's life and therefore supposed resurrection. They just seem to talk about these Christians and what to do about them. And so I'll just read her conclusion. From these secular sources, within 150 years of Jesus' resurrection, we can draw the following conclusions about Jesus. 1, they considered him virtuous. 2, he worked miracles. 3, his early disciples did not abandon his teachings. 4, his early advocates were punished for their beliefs. 5, his early advocates sometimes risked their lives and died for him. And 6, in confirmation of the gospel accounts, we have secular evidence that an earthquake and eclipse occurred on the day of his crucifixion. What do you think of her conclusions?
Well, I mean, I don't think that any of those sources actually prove any of those points. The whole eclipse thing, that's actually not proven by our current, like how we calculate eclipses and whatnot. We can actually go back in time and see when those would have been. And like around the time that Jesus would have been crucified, there was no eclipse like over over Palestine or whatnot. And she's getting that from one of the secular sources up there that talk about an eclipse or whatnot. But even then, I think that those people are getting their information from Christian like sources, and so they would have been like, oh, there had to have been an eclipse or whatever. But also, the Gospels don't say it was an eclipse. They said that the sun blacked out and like the sun, was completely covered throughout all of the land. And I'm not sure about an earthquake. I think that the possibility of an earthquake happening is fine, but that doesn't actually corroborate the Gospels. I mean, you would have to assume that an earthquake happening right around the time that somebody in a magical book says that it happened, then I guess then it definitely happened. But I mean, I don't think that that's exactly proof that it did happen. I think that maybe they were drawing on from personal experience, like, oh, we felt this earthquake, and they might have worked that into the story, but there's no way to decipher between the two situations, if you know what I'm talking about. Like, there's no way to know if it was inserted later because they had that experience, or if it actually occurred during the event that they say that it occurred during. So yeah. I don't like her conclusion in general because she jumps to the conclusion without actually having proper evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree with that. And she finishes her article with a sentence, and with God, all things are possible. So, what do you have to say to that?
Well, see, here's the thing: is that a lot of these Christian apologists and historicists that are Christian, they put a higher probability that something magical will happen rather than something natural. And I think that that is kind of the crux of their inability to understand like where a mythicist is coming from, or where an atheist is coming from, because I would say that a natural event is way more probable than a magical event. So if you think back to like Paul, I think it's much more probable that he was a schizotypal person rather than he saw like risen Jesus. I also think that Mark being dated to the 70s is much more probable than Mark existing earlier and successfully predicting that like the temple in Jerusalem would fall. So I think that any historian that is honest about their examination of the evidence would also come to those conclusions, because at no point in time in the past has anything magical overridden something natural. So you would have to have a lot of like good evidence in order to overturn that pre-existing notion. And I just don't think that Jesus has that at all. The evidence that they have is circumstantial and doesn't actually prove what they're saying that it proves. They're just seeing the name Jesus and being like, oh, that proves it. He was there. It's like, but okay, well, look, there's a book, Harry Potter. Harry Potter is real. I mean, I could do the same thing, but because Harry Potter's not like an actual religion or cult, it's like totally unreasonable for me to think that. But sure, your guy died on a cross, and then every Sunday you eat his flesh and drink his blood. That's totally rational.
Of course, yeah. I'm just a bit wary of your time. But do you have time to take a few questions from the chat?
Oh, definitely.
Okay,
I know we have a few people. We have a few people watching.
Okay, so if you've got any questions for the Godless Engineer, now's the time.
Well, I know that when we had talked before, I think that you were kind of on like the kind of agnostic side of mythicism. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you feel now about the question in general, like whether or not Jesus existed?
Yeah, I think I'm coming round to your way of thinking. Yeah, I think it's it is highly unlikely that that Jesus actually existed historically, and I think I definitely do not believe that he did and said what the gospel writers claimed that he did and said.
Sorry, I was typing in the chat. So what was your comment?
Sorry, yeah, yeah. I think I am, leaning more towards your, way of thinking. But certainly, I don't believe that Jesus did and said what the gospel writers claimed that he did and said.
Yeah. No, yeah, most of the time, most atheists in general will be like, well, I don't think that Jesus of the Bible existed, but there had to be a guy that existed. And personally, I feel like that's a little lazy, like intellectually lazy. Not to be like demeaning to anybody that feels that way, but like I was once in that position of like, oh, there had to be a guy, right? Until you start actually looking for evidence that to say, oh, he definitely did exist, then you kind of find yourself wanting. Like you don't have evidence to actually be able to confidently say he definitely existed. A lot of people misuse the Occam's razor argument in order to say, well, he had to have existed because it's the simplest answer. And I would say that they're kind of wrong about what Occam's razor is, because Occam's razor is more about which hypothesis of competing hypotheses has the least amount of assumptions that are made. And I feel like my particular position has the least amount of assumptions that you could have in this particular conversation. Like with just assuming that Jesus even existed, I mean, you're kind of presupposing the answer. Like, well, there had to be a guy there to start it, and then you have a kind of a variant of, oh, it was a lot of different guys that were cobbled together all into one. And I mean, I guess that's kind of true, but at the same time, there's nothing to suggest that multiple like guys were running around and then somebody stuck them all together. For me personally, using evidence, from Jewish historians, as well as the Old Testament, it kind of seems to me like there were several groups of Jews that were expecting Messiah to come, and when he hadn't come yet, they just invented one, or they just assumed that he did come. And the way that like information about him was reading from the gospel, or not gospels, but reading from the scriptures. And so I feel like that has the least amount of assumptions just because of the actual background information that we have concerning it.
Yeah. I think Jen with one N was asking, when in your atheistic journey did you come to the mythicists, conclusion?
I would say that it was probably a couple years after like I became an atheist. Because I found myself like in arguments on Facebook, and I was trying to say like, well, yeah, Jesus did exist, but at the same time, what I wanted to do was have the information like, oh yes, see, here's the stone where Jesus carved his name and wrote it with his lightning dick. um you know I wanted to have something like that, but when I actually started investigating it, and looking into the actual like historical references to Jesus, there's nothing there to actually cement him in history. All you have are either forged insertions like Josephus, or people that are just saying, "Oh, hey, look, Christians existed at this time. Here's what those Christians believed." And then you have just the general progression of the how the Bible was actually written, because you got Paul first, and then everything after that is a reflection of Paul.
Yeah.
See, I think Tatted Atheist asked me, like what level. Yeah, Tatted Atheist, what level is your degree? I am working on my master's. That's pretty awesome, Tatted. I have my master's in software engineering, and I got a bachelor's in computer engineering, which lately people have been saying, oh, that's not real engineering, and to them I say, fuck you.
Okay, fair enough. And on that bombshell, I think we're going to leave it there.
Okay.
And I just want to, thank you, very much for coming on my channel and helping me to dissect this nonsense by SJ Thomason. Do you have any final thoughts you want to add?
Yeah. What I would say to anybody that's finding themselves kind of in the agnostic or the totally historical kind of position is to just take a critical look at the actual evidence. I'm not saying that you have to like read Carrier and believe everything that he says. What I'm saying is just take a look at the actual evidence, because there's, I mean, this was a really good overview that SJ did of the bad evidence for Jesus. But if you actually go out there and look for references to Jesus in history, you won't find any in the first century that are actual firsthand eyewitnesses. All you'll have are opinions that are like, of course he existed because this is the consensus. And that kind of appeal to authority is actually fallacious, because it shouldn't be that, oh, the consensus is this, therefore that is what it is. The consensus is that way because it should be founded on solid information and solid evidence. If the evidence can be disproven, then it should be disproven, like it was done with the Old Testament and the first 5 books of that. And so I think I'm just saying that, look at the actual evidence at hand. And a lot of people want to compare this to like flat earthery or anything like that, and it's simply just not. Because the thing is that like the shape of the earth is based on solid science, solid evidence, whereas the Jesus existing in history and the reliability of the Bible and everything like that is not based on anything that's solid. Like there's no solid answer to it, like we have with Pilate. Pilate, we know, existed in history because there's a huge rock that's got his name carved in it and it's got his title. And a lot of people like to say, oh, well, Pilate existed in history, therefore the Gospels are true. And that's kind of a general, what is it called? I think it's like a hasty generalization or something. I think there's a more specific fallacy, but it's where you take one part of something and then you apply it to the whole of it. And so just because the Bible gets like 1 or 2 things right, that means the entire thing is correct. And that's not at all what it is. So that's my final thoughts. Investigate the actual sources, the actual evidence for Jesus, and just know that you have solid evidence for what you're saying. And or preface, like for me, I say that he probably didn't exist, because I think that it's more likely he didn't exist than he did, but that still leaves it open to the possibility of him actually existing. Like we could uncover like that tomb with his name carved in it. I mean, I don't know what would solidly prove it, but I think that that would be better evidence than what SJ is presenting.
Okay. Well, once again, thanks a lot for coming along and helping me to dissect this article. And for those of you watching, if you're not yet subscribed to Godless Engineer, then then do so, because as you've heard, he really knows his stuff, and he's a funny guy as well, and he's very knowledgeable, and you won't be disappointed. So subscribe to Godless Engineer if you haven't already, and thanks a lot for watching. And if you've liked this video, then give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here, then do subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss another video.
Yeah, and I say definitely subscribe to Black Sofa. I mean, I am, so you guys should be too.
Okay. Bye for now, everyone.